The cold arrives before anything else. It settles into the stone, into the pine needles, into the long silence between mountains. Skyrim breathes slowly, the way old things do, unhurried, vast, and full of stories that have been waiting longer than anyone can remember. These are some of those stories. Before you drift any further, consider subscribing for more journey like this, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. There is a kind of stillness in this land that feels earned. The holds and their hearth fires, the tombs and their silence, the roads winding between, each one holds something small and strange and true. Tonight, we wander through them all together, not in haste, not with purpose, simply wandering, the way the wind does across the reach, the way snow drifts down through the pines of Falkreath, settling where it will. In the long stretch of time before the events of the game, the world that would become Skyrim was not yet a province carved by maps and held by jarls. It was a place defined entirely by its weather and its will, a northern wilderness where survival demanded patience, and patience became something close to wisdom. The Nords who eventually claimed this land did not do so easily. They arrived over time, in waves, each generation pressing a little deeper into the cold, learning the shape of the mountains the way you learn the shape of a familiar face. The land itself has a name in older texts that predates what players know. In the earliest records of Tamrielic history, the region was sometimes referred to by its elemental character rather than any political identity. It was called the Seat of Storms. The northern sea threw weather inland with a kind of indifference, and the mountains caught that weather and shaped it into something legendary. The blizzards that sweep across the tundra today are not different in any meaningful way from the blizzards that fell during the Merethic era. They have always come. They have always stayed longer than expected. What this means for the people who live here is a particular kind of adaptation. The Nords developed their resistance to cold not merely as a racial trait described in dusty tomes, but as a lived inheritance passed from parent to child across uncountable generations. To be born in Skyrim is to be born already knowing, on some level beneath language, that warmth is something you carry inside you, that the fire you build matters more than the fire that fell from the sky. Long before any dragonborn walked the roads between holds, the land was defined by its relationship with dragons. This is not a metaphor or a piece of mythologized history dressed up as fact. The dragons were real. They ruled in the earliest age of the world with a completeness that no later empire could replicate, because their authority was not political or military in the way those words are usually understood. Their authority was linguistic. Their very speech carried the weight of creation. The dragon language, known in the texts as Dovahkiin, is one of the most carefully considered elements woven into the fabric of Skyrim's world. It was not simply invented as a decorative flourish. The language has its own consistent grammar, its own phonological patterns, its own internal logic. When a dragon speaks, the words are not merely sounds. They are, within the world's own cosmology, a fundamental expression of reality. The Thu'um, the voice, functions as an extension of this idea, the notion that language and existence are not separate things. This makes the study of dragon words something more than academic. There are 133 words of power distributed across the landscape of Skyrim, embedded in ancient walls and carried by the dragons themselves. Each word represents a fragment of something the oldest beings in the world once used the way others use breath, automatically, constantly, and without thinking about what it cost. The mountains of Skyrim are not merely scenery, they are a presence. The throat of the world, standing at the approximate center of the province, reaches an elevation that places it above the clouds for much of the year. On clear days, which are rarer than one might hope, the summit offers a view that encompasses a startling proportion of the land below. The Nords have a particular relationship with this peak that goes beyond geography. The Greybeards, the silent order of monks who have lived at High Hrothgar for centuries, chose their location with full awareness of what the mountain represents in Nordic cosmology. It is the point where earth and sky are closest to one another, and in their tradition, that closeness carries significance that is difficult to translate into ordinary terms. The path upward, marked by 10 carved stones bearing the words of the Alduin's Wall legend, is not incidental. It is a deliberate arrangement, a kind of extended meditation made of stone and elevation. The 7,000 steps are not, strictly speaking, 7,000. The actual count has been a point of quiet debate among those who have thought carefully about such things, and the number appears to be closer to 700 when measured. With any rigor, but the name persists. 7,000 steps. It is a number that sounds like something requiring everything you have, and in that sense, it is more honest than precision would be. There is a city in the eastern reaches of Skyrim, built into and around a massive stone arch that spans a mountain pass that holds more history in its walls than most places manage in their entire surrounding landscape. Windhelm is the oldest inhabited city in all of Skyrim, and according to some scholars, potentially the oldest continuously occupied settlement in the whole of Tamriel. The stone from which it was built was quarried before recorded history, fitted together by hands whose names no one remembers, under a sky that looked the same as this one, but meant something different. The Palace of the Kings, which dominates the city's inner quarter, was constructed by Ysgramor himself, according to the oldest accounts. Ysgramor arrived in Skyrim after the catastrophe of Surthal, the Night of Tears, when the ancient snow elves attacked the first human settlement on this land, and Windhelm was where he made his stand. To walk through that palace today, even knowing what it has become in later ages of conflict and politics, is to stand in a place where the line between legend and architecture becomes very thin. The stone of Windhelm holds cold the way stone in northern places always does. Even inside, close to the hearth fires, there is a baseline chill that no amount of warmth entirely removes. The residents speak of it without complaint. It is simply the nature of the place. The cold, they will tell you if you ask, has always been here. The civil war that runs beneath the surface of Skyrim, like an underground river, is not a simple conflict between two clear sides. It is, at its roots, a disagreement about identity, about what it means to be Nordic, about who has the right to define that, and about how much history a people should carry before the weight of it becomes something other than pride. The Stormcloaks believe, with full sincerity, that Skyrim should be governed by Skyrim's own. The Imperial faction believes, with equal sincerity, that the strength of Tamriel depends on a unity that transcends individual holds and their peculiarities. Neither argument is without merit. Neither position is without cost. The war has been grinding on long enough that some of the older residents of the province have stopped trying to explain it and simply describe the way it feels, a constant low. Noise in the background, like weather moving in from the north, something you can't stop but have learned to read. Farmers along the roads speak of supply lines disrupted and taxes collected by whoever holds the nearest garrison. Merchants in the city speak more carefully, aware that the wrong words to the wrong customer can create difficulties. What the conflict produces, quietly and without anyone intending it, is a landscape of incredible archaeological richness. Ancient camps, fortifications built and abandoned and built again, roads maintained by one side and neglected by the other. The war writes itself onto the land in ways that will take generations to fully read. The city of Markarth is built inside a Dwemer ruin, and this fact alone separates it from every other settlement in Skyrim. The Dwemer, the dwarves of Elder Scrolls tradition, though they bore little resemblance to the stout underground craftsmen of other fantasy traditions, were a people of extraordinary technical accomplishment who vanished from the world entirely during an event called the Battle of Red Mountain, roughly 4,000 years before the events of the game. No bodies were ever found. No explanation was ever agreed upon. What they left behind in Markarth is staggering. The pipes and gears and pumping mechanisms that keep the city's water flowing and its forges operating are still functional, maintained now by a small number of engineers who understand perhaps a fraction of what their predecessors built. The Nords who eventually settled in the dwarven ruins did so with a combination of pragmatism and unease. The stone hallways echo differently than ordinary hallways. The machinery in the walls operates on a schedule no living person set. Beneath Markarth, in the deeper excavations, Thalmor have moved in. The Thalmor, descendants of the snow elves, who were betrayed by the Dwemer and subjected to a deliberate process of degradation, now occupy the lower reaches of many Dwemer, ruins across the province. They are blind, driven by patterns that resemble instinct more than thought, and yet in their movements there is something that carries the ghost of what their ancestors once were. A people, a culture, something lost so completely that its absence is the most eloquent statement about what happened. The snow elves, before their fall, were not the creatures the Thalmor have become. In the ancient texts, they are described as a civilization of some sophistication, artistic, philosophical, possessed of their own cosmology and their own understanding of magic. They had cities, they had temples, they had debates about the nature of existence that would not have seemed out of place among the scholars of the Somerset Isles. The knight paladin Gelibor, who can be encountered in the Forgotten Vale, is one of the last surviving snow elves who was not subjected to the treatment that degraded his people. He has existed in something close to stasis for thousands of years, maintaining a shrine to Ariel in a valley that the outside world has largely forgotten. To speak with him is to encounter something that should not exist, a living artifact, a remnant of a civilization that history has classified as extinct. His grief is not performed, it is simply present, the way the cold is present. A fact of his existence that he has had longer than most creatures have lived to come to terms with. He speaks of his people the way you might speak of a dream you remember very clearly but can no longer enter. The words are precise. The feeling behind them has no edges. In the southeast of the province, the city of Riften sits at the edge of a great lake, its docks extending over dark water, its streets layered with the particular atmosphere. That comes when legitimate commerce and less legitimate commerce have shared the same space for so long that the line between them has become academic. The Thieves' Guild operates here as it has operated in various forms throughout Tamrielic history, and the influence of that organization has shaped the city's culture in ways that are difficult to fully trace. The Ratway, which runs beneath the city, is one of those places that accumulates people who have run out of better options. It is damp and poorly lit and smells of the lake that surrounds it, and the people who live there have learned to maintain a careful neutrality toward strangers, which is to say, they have learned not to be seen. What the Ratway provides in exchange for its considerable discomforts is invisibility, and in Riften, invisibility has a market value. The lake itself, Lake Honrich, is large enough that on overcast days the far shore disappears into gray. Slaughterfish patrol the deeper waters, though those who know what to look for can read the shore for their presence before committing to a swim. The Riften docks have a particular smell in the morning, cold water and pine tar, and the remnants of the previous evening's catch, and it is a smell that is entirely specific to this place and this hour of day. Some of the dock workers have been here so long that they no longer register it. Visitors always do. The College of Winterhold stands at the edge of a cliff at the northern tip of Skyrim, partially collapsed into the sea below, the victim of an event called the Great Collapse. That occurred roughly a century before the game's timeline. The city of Winterhold was largely destroyed in that catastrophe. The college survived. The relationship between those two facts is a source of ongoing tension that the Nords of the region express, with varying degrees of restraint depending on how much they have had. To drink. The college, as an institution, predates its current building by a considerable margin. Winterhold has been associated with the study of magic for as long as there have been written records of the North, and perhaps longer. The Archmage's quarters contain artifacts and texts that span several eras of magical research, accumulated by predecessors, whose names appear in the historical record with varying degrees of specificity. Some are well documented, others are known only by the objects they left behind. Magic in Skyrim exists in a particular relationship with the culture around it. The Nords have a tradition of suspicion toward what they call unnatural power, a suspicion grounded not in ignorance, but in specific historical experiences, events in which magical forces caused losses that no amount of martial courage could prevent. This suspicion is not universal, and it is not unexamined, but it is real, and the college's position on a literal and figurative cliff edge captures something true about its relationship to the province it inhabits. The standing stones of Skyrim are a feature of the landscape that most travelers notice early and some never think about again. There are 13 of them, distributed across the province with a spacing that feels deliberate without being perfectly systematic. Each one grants a particular kind of blessing to those who activate it, influences on the rate at which skills develop, on resistances to certain kinds of harm, on the timing of recovery from injury and exhaustion. The lore around these stones is older than the stones themselves, in the sense that the idea they represent, that certain configurations of power in the natural world can be tapped by those who know how to approach them, appears in Nordic religious texts that predate the construction of any permanent settlement. The stones are not the original form of this idea. They are a particular civilization's answer to something that had been understood in various ways by many peoples before them. The ritual stone, located east of Whiterun, has the most striking effect of any of the 13. Those under its influence can, once each day, call upon the dead to fight alongside them for a period before those raised dead return to their permanent rest. This is not presented in any text as a comfortable power. It is presented as a true power, something that works and that carries with it the full weight of what it is doing. Whiterun sits at the center of Skyrim in more than one sense. Geographically, it occupies the middle of the largest open plain in the province, the tundra that stretches between the major mountain ranges and provides a natural meeting place for roads coming from every direction. Politically, it functions as a kind of neutral ground, a city that has historically tried to avoid the worst consequences of whatever conflict the surrounding holds are engaged, and with varying success. The city is built on a bluff, with Dragonshriek, the Jarl's Hall, at the highest point, and the market and residential districts stepping down toward the main gate below. This arrangement means that anyone entering Whiterun walks uphill for the duration of their visit, which gives the city a particular physical experience. You are always, in Whiterun, either climbing toward something or descending from it. The Gildergreen in the Wind District is a tree of some considerable history, grown from a cutting of the Eldergleam, which is among the oldest living things in Skyrim, perhaps, in all of Tamriel. The Eldergleam itself, located in a natural grotto to the east, is ancient enough that its root system has broken through stone that was already old when the first Nords arrived. Trees of that age have a quality of presence that is difficult to describe accurately. They are not wise in the way that people are wise. They are something else, patient, in a way that has no implication of effort, simply existing on a timeline that makes the human scale of things feel briefly insubstantial. The religion of the Nords centers primarily on the 8 divines, or the 9, depending on the era and the particular Nord you ask, a pantheon that shares names but not always characteristics with the deity systems of other Tamrielic cultures. Talos, the 9th divine, is a figure of intense political relevance during the game's timeline, his worship having been banned under the terms of the White Gold Concordat. The Nords' resistance to this ban is not merely religious in character. It is the expression of something about identity, the belief that a man who became a god through his own deeds represents something particular to what being Nord means. Dabella, the divine associated with beauty and love and the arts, is worshipped in a temple in Markarth with an interior that manages to feel warm despite being built into. Dwemerstone. The Sibyl of Dabella is a young girl chosen through a process of divination, destined to serve as the goddess's earthly representative when the previous Sibyl passes away. There is something genuinely moving about this tradition when considered fully, the combination of a child's ordinary existence with a sacred role, the way devotion and destiny arrive without being asked for. Kynareth, the divine of nature and wind and the sky, has a temple in Whiterun that is tended by a healer named Danica Pure Spring, who carries her faith with a directness that is slightly unusual among the game's clerics. She does not perform her devotion. She simply lives it in the specific and unglamorous way that genuine faith often looks, as a daily practice rather than an occasional demonstration. The Companions of Whiterun are the oldest active warriors guild in Skyrim, their lineage tracing back to the 500 companions of Ysgramor, the army that returned to Skyrim after the Night of Tears to reclaim the land from the Snow Elves. Not all 500 of those original warriors are remembered by name, but the ones who are occupy a particularly honored place in Nordic memory. Their deeds are recounted in the Companions' Mead Hall at Jorvaskr, a building that is itself made from the hull of one of the longships that carried the original companions. Across the sea, Jorvaskr is upturned and embedded in the earth of Whiterun's Wind District, one of the oldest structures in a city that itself has considerable age. The tradition of honoring the ship in this way, turning a vessel of arrival into a home, making the journey itself into a dwelling, is one of the more poetic gestures in a culture that is sometimes described primarily in terms of its martial character. The Nords knew something about the relationship between traveling and arriving, and they built that knowledge into the places where they chose to stay. The inner circle of the companions, the ones who have taken the blood of Hircine, carry with them a secret that complicates the straightforward heroism the guild's public face. Presence. Lycanthropy, as it exists in Skyrim, is not simply a curse in the conventional sense. It is a pact, an exchange, with all the moral complexity that word implies. The beast blood grants extraordinary strength. What it costs is the soul's eventual destination. Hircine, the Daedric prince whose domain is the hunt, is one of the more ancient forces acknowledged in Tamrielic religion, and one of the more straightforwardly comprehensible. In terms of what he values and why, he prizes the contest between predator and prey, not as cruelty but as the fundamental expression of a law he considers sacred, that all living things exist in relationship with all other living things, and that this relationship is defined by the question of who pursues and who is pursued. His shrine, and the questline associated with it, involves a hunt on an island that is in some ways a distillation of his philosophy expressed as a physical space. The island becomes a closed system, everything reduced to its essential elements: who can find whom, who can survive, what the shape of the hunt reveals about the participants. There is something genuinely unsettling about how reasonable this all feels within its own framework. The Daedric princes, as a group, occupy a strange position in Tamrielic cosmology. They are not gods, in the sense the divines are gods. They did not participate in the creation of the world. What they are, instead, is something the world created around itself, vast expressions of certain principles or drives or ideas, given consciousness and will and an interest in. The affairs of mortals that is never entirely benevolent, but is occasionally useful. Azura, the Daedric prince of dusk and dawn, and the space between states, is one of the few Daedric princes who is regarded with something approaching genuine devotion rather than the complicated mix of respect and wariness that characterizes most interactions with these beings. Her shrine stands on a high peak above Winterhold, the statue facing east to greet the rising sun with its permanent stone gaze. On clear mornings, the light hits the statue from behind, and the snow around it takes on a quality of color that is difficult to name. Her most devoted followers in Skyrim are the Dwemer, the dark elves, who regard her as one of the three good Daedra, along with Mephala and Boethia. This designation is not universally agreed upon by scholars of Daedric theology, but it reflects something genuine about the relationship between the Dwemer people and this particular prince. Azura warned Morrowind. The warning was not heeded. The mountain erupted. The people scattered. And through all of that, Azura's devotion to her chosen people did not change, even if what she could do for them had limits. Her artifact, the Star of Azura, is a soul gem unlike any other. A gem that can be emptied and refilled, that does not shatter after use, that persists. In a tradition where soul gems are consumed and discarded, this permanence carries a weight that the object's modest size does not suggest. The wilderness of Falkreath Hold in the south of Skyrim is defined by its forest, an old-growth pine forest that absorbs light even on bright days and generates its own version of silence, the particular quiet that exists when sound is not absent, but rather softened by so many layers of wood and needle and accumulated years that it arrives at the ear as something gentle. People who have spent time in forests like this often describe the experience afterward, not in terms of what they saw or heard, but in terms of how they felt while they were there. The Hold's most significant landmark, apart from the town of Falkreath itself, is the cemetery that occupies a considerable portion of the town space. It is famously among the largest graveyards in Skyrim relative to population, and this proportion has become something the residents relate to with the dry humor of people who have had a long time to adjust to a reputation they did not choose. The dead of Falkreath are not neglected. The graves are tended. The names on the stones are legible. In the forest south of Falkreath, a dead tree marks the entrance to a place called the Pine Watch, and deeper in the trees, the Dark Brotherhood's old sanctuary exists at the bottom of a pond, accessible only to those who know the right phrase to say to the right face on the right door. The Brotherhood's sanctuaries are designed to be invisible from the outside, not dramatically hidden, not fortified in ways that draw attention, just absent from the map that most people carry in their heads. The Dark Brotherhood itself is an organization that has existed for longer than most of Skyrim's current political structures. Its roots trace back to a religious order called the Morag Tong, which operated in Morrowind as a legally sanctioned assassins guild, killers who worked within a specific contractual and spiritual framework, their murders considered acts of ritual as much as acts of violence. The Brotherhood broke from this tradition, or rather, a splinter group that would become the Brotherhood took a different approach, worshipping a being called Sithis, the Void, the nothing at the edge of creation, and developing their own covenant with their patron. The Night Mother, the dead matron who serves as the Brotherhood's spiritual center, receives the whispered prayers of those who wish to purchase a death, passing the information to the listener through a communication that works at a remove from ordinary consciousness, arriving in a particular kind of dream. This arrangement is unusual, even within the context of a setting full of unusual arrangements. Most divine or quasi-divine communication in Skyrim happens in more direct ways: visions, voices, an artifact that responds to touch. The Night Mother speaks only through a single chosen person, and the choosing is not done by any living member of the Brotherhood. What this means in practical terms is that the Brotherhood has always carried within its structure a tension between organization and revelation, between the practical requirements of running a clandestine guild and the unpredictable demands of a spiritual tradition that does not explain itself. The Thieves' Guild has its own covenant, structured around a figure named Nocturnal, the Daedric Prince of the Night, of shadows, of the things that exist in the spaces between. Where light falls, this is not, as it might initially appear, a simple patron relationship where a guild performs services in exchange for protection. The relationship is considerably more complex, and the full nature of it only becomes clear if one follows the Thieves' Guild questline to its conclusion. Nocturnal's interest in the guild is tied to something called the Skeleton Key, an artifact of extraordinary property, a key that opens any lock. that cannot be permanently lost because it always finds its way back to a hand that knows how to use it. What this key represents in Nocturnal's cosmology is access to something fundamental about the nature of potential and possibility. The door that every lock guards in this framework is not a physical door. The Twilight Sepulchre, where the key belongs, is a place that exists partially outside normal experience. The Shade Guardians who walk its hallways are former Nightingales, members of the guild who made a pact with Nocturnal in life and continue to serve after death in a capacity. That is not exactly comfortable, but is, according to those who know the details, exactly what was agreed upon. To the northwest, past the mountains that guard the approach to Solitude, the hold of Hofengar opens toward the sea. Solitude itself is built on a great natural arch of stone above the water, and the view from the city's walls on a clear day is one of the most expansive available in the province. The imperial presence here is felt in the architecture as much as in the soldiers, wider streets, taller buildings with more ornament, a general sense of having been designed for a capital rather than growing into one. The Bard's College in Solitude is one of those institutions that seems, from the outside, to have a role that is primarily ceremonial. The training of musicians and poets and oral historians might appear, in a province in the middle of a civil war, to be a secondary concern, but the bards of Skyrim preserve something that military and political institutions cannot: the specific texture of what it was like to be alive in this particular place at this particular moment. The songs they carry from hold to hold carry information in a form that archives cannot replicate. The festival of the burning of King Olaf is one of the Bard's College's most visible traditions, an annual burning of an effigy of a historical king whose reputation the college has spent generations systematically dismantling through verse and performance. The politics of this tradition are layered. The poetry that drives it is, by any reasonable measure, excellent. Solitude's Blue Palace has served as the seat of Skyrim's imperial-aligned government for generations, and the court it houses is a fully functioning political ecosystem with its own internal dynamics, alliances, and grievances that operate largely independently of whoever is currently sitting on the throne in Cyrodiil. Elisif the Fair, the Jarl at the time of the game's events, is a young widow navigating a situation for which her upbringing did not fully prepare her, and her court reflects. This, full of advisors with their own agendas and a steward whose loyalty is the clearest thing in the room. The Pelagius wing of the Blue Palace is accessible by a slightly unorthodox method and contains within it a space that functions as both a historical record and a portrait of a particular kind of suffering. Pelagius the Mad, who held the throne of the empire several generations before the game's events, spent time in Solitude, and the rooms associated with him have taken on a quality that is difficult to describe in architectural terms alone. The wing is haunted, not in the dramatic way of Nordic barrows, where the dead walk and the cold is specific and hostile. It is haunted in the quieter way that rooms associated with profound mental anguish sometimes are, the feeling, without any particular evidence, that whatever happened here has not entirely finished happening. The Reach, Markarth's hold, is one of the most geographically dramatic holds in the province, a landscape of exposed rock and fast-moving rivers and narrow mountain passes that give it a closed interior quality, even though it occupies a substantial portion of the province's western edge. The Forsworn, who occupy much of the Reach's wilderness, are not simply bandits given a different name. They are the remnant of a political movement, the Reachmen who briefly held their own kingdom during the Markarth incident roughly 30 years before the game's events. Imperial forces reclaimed the city, and the Nords who had backed that reclamation dealt with the political consequences in ways that the Forsworn have neither forgotten nor forgiven. Their camps are built with a particular aesthetic, bones and feathers, and the specific plant materials of the Reach, arranged in ways that suggest ritual as much as shelter. The Hagraven leaders of the Forsworn communities have traded something human for something else, undergoing a transformation that grants power and removes certain limitations that living people carry. What it costs them is visible in the way they move, the way they regard visitors, the quality of attention in their eyes. Karthspire, in the heart of the Reach, guards the approach to Sky Haven Temple, one of the most significant sites in the province's ancient history, a structure built by the Blades during the Merethic era to house a prophecy carved in a form that requires specific knowledge to read. The bas relief of Alduin's wall inside the temple tells the story of the Dragon War in a visual language that is striking even to those who cannot parse every detail. The Blades themselves are an organization whose history spans much more of Tamrielic civilization than most of Skyrim's residents are aware of. In their origins, they were the Akaviri, dragon slayers from a continent east of Tamriel, who crossed the sea and were defeated by the Nordic ruler Riemann Cyrodiil, and who then, in one of those strange reversals that history produces occasionally, swore loyalty to the man who had defeated them and became his personal guard. Over centuries, this role evolved into something more complex, a protection service, an intelligence organization, and eventually the institution most closely associated with, supporting whoever carried the blood of the Dragonborn. By the time of Skyrim's events, the Blades have been largely destroyed by the Thalmor, their members scattered and hiding under assumed identities in ordinary lives. The two who remain in the province carry the weight of this institutional loss in different ways. Delphine, the innkeeper of Riverwood, who is not simply an innkeeper, channels it into a focused intensity that occasionally shades into something less productive. Esbern, the scholar who has been hiding in the Ratway for years, channels it into the obsessive study of the very catastrophe he believed was coming. The Thalmor, the ruling body of the Aldmeri Dominion, are present in Skyrim as an occupying diplomatic force whose authority to exist there is an irritating consequence of the White Gold Concordat. Their embassy stands in the mountains north of Solitude, and their justiciars operate throughout the province, enforcing the ban on Talos worship with a thoroughness that several of Skyrim's Jarls find diplomatically uncomfortable. The Thalmor's stated ambition is the preservation of elven heritage and the rollback of what they consider the historical injustices inflicted on Mer by men. Their actual ambition, or at least the ambition of their ideological extreme, is considerably larger. Certain documents found in the embassy, if one is in a position to read them, suggest an understanding of Tamrielic metaphysics that goes beyond political theology into something more like cosmic strategy. The Thalmor understand the towers, the structures around which the world's existence is organized, and their interest in those towers is not academic. The High Elves who enforce the Concordat's terms in Skyrim are not uniformly zealots. There are individuals among them who carry their instructions with varying degrees of personal conviction, and some who have been posted to this cold northern province as a consequence of political failure at home. The Thalmor embassy's social dynamics, glimpsed at the party that can be attended early in the main questline, are a compressed version of a court culture in which everyone is being watched and everyone knows it. The Dwemer of Skyrim are refugees in the particular sense of people who have been forced from a homeland by a catastrophe and have not found anything in the new place that fully replaces what was lost. The eruption of Red Mountain devastated Morrowind, not simply as a political or military event, but as a geographic one, reshaping the landscape of an entire region and displacing a population that had been rooted there for millennia. Many of those displaced came north. The Grey Quarter and Windhelm, where a significant portion of Windhelm's Dwemer population lives, is one of the more honest representations of what refugee experience looks like. In practice, the gap between where you have arrived and the language and customs and social structures that determine whether arrival becomes belonging. The Nords of Windhelm are not uniformly hostile to their Dwemer neighbors, but the structural disadvantages are consistent enough that the distinction between deliberate discrimination and accumulated indifference becomes academic from the perspective of those experiencing it. Morrowind itself, as a presence in Skyrim, exists primarily in the east, in the landscapes near Windhelm and along the border, where ash from Red Mountain still sometimes colors the sky on certain wind conditions, and where the cultural memory of Dwemer characters runs closest to the surface. The Dwemer treat history differently than Nords do. They carry it differently, as something immediately present rather than something commemorated. The Argonians of the docks in Windhelm live outside the city walls entirely, a fact that tells you something specific about how they are regarded by the humans who control the gate. The Argonians of Black Marsh have historically maintained a complicated relationship with all of Tamriel's other peoples, a complexity rooted partly in the nature of Black Marsh, itself a region so inhospitable to non-Argonians that most military campaigns into it have simply dissolved into the terrain, and partly in the nature of the Argonians, who communicate with and through their landscape in ways that do not translate cleanly into the conventions of imperial political culture. An Argonian in Skyrim is a long way from home, and in Windhelm is reminded of this at the city gate. The dock workers who load and unload cargo on the Windhelm docks do so in weather that would concern most people and seem entirely unbothered, which may reflect physiological adaptation or may reflect the more pragmatic truth that there is no better option available, and they have made peace with this. The Hist, the trees of Black Marsh that form the center of Argonian spiritual and biological life, are genuinely alien in the framework of the world. They are ancient beyond any individual lifespan. They communicate in ways that are not fully understood even by those who have studied them carefully, and their relationship too. Argonian individuals involve something that resembles collective consciousness in certain readings of the available evidence. Argonians away from the Hist are described in some texts as operating at a slight remove from their full selves, not diminished exactly, but partial. The city of Riften, for all its reputation as a city of crime and conspiracy, contains within it a genuine community, the Boulder Fall Pass, the market, the Temple of Mara. That functions in the ordinary ways that communities function, regardless of what the guild is doing in the Ratway below. Maramal, the priest of Mara who operates out of the Bee and Barb Tavern before eventually taking up residence in the temple, is one of those characters who is present in multiple contexts in the city and whose sincerity is legible in each of them. The Temple of Mara in Riften is where the marriage ceremony for the Dragonborn takes place if they choose to pursue it. The Amulet of Mara, which signals romantic availability in Skyrim's culture, a piece of world building that has a practical function in the game but also tells you something about how this culture handles the expression of interest in others, is available from Maramal for a modest price, or can be found in various locations around the province. The Nords, and apparently most of Skyrim's other inhabitants, have found a way to make romantic intention legible as an object, which is a particular solution to a universal problem. Marriage in Skyrim is presented with a matter-of-factness that is slightly unusual for a fantasy setting. It does not require extensive courtship quests or complicated social navigation. It requires genuine assistance, some action that demonstrates care or competence, and then the expression of interest, and then the ceremony. It is, in this sense, somewhat honest about what lasting relationships are actually built on. The plains of Winterhold are home to the giants, enormous beings who maintain their herds of mammoths across the tundra with a patience and apparent expertise that suggests generational knowledge being applied to a task they take seriously. The giants are not aggressive unless provoked, a fact that players learn at varying speeds depending on their particular approach to the world. Their camps are arranged around their hearth fires with a domestic logic. Certain things belong in certain places, and the giants enforce this spatial understanding with considerable force if it is violated. The mammoths they tend are among the largest land creatures in the province, and the relationship between the giants and their herds appears to be genuinely mutualistic rather than simply extractive. Giants protect their mammoths with the same energy they use to defend their camps, and mammoth skulls placed at the boundaries of giant territory serve a dual purpose as markers of domain and as something that looks very much like memorial. The giant language, which has not been decoded to any meaningful extent in the available scholarship, consists of communications that are difficult to parse from the outside. What can be observed is that giants respond to their own kind's communications over considerable distances, and that the information transmitted appears to be specific enough to coordinate behavior without any visible messenger. Whether this is a language in the conventional sense or something that operates differently is one of those questions that remains genuinely open. Mammoth cheese, which exists in Skyrim's item economy, is created from mammoth milk, which implies a relationship between giants and their mammoths that goes further than pure. Pastoral management. The cheese appears in giant camps with some regularity and trades for value in the ordinary commerce of the province, which means that at some point the chain of custody for this particular foodstuff passes through human or mer hands, raising questions about the nature of that commercial relationship with beings who are generally regarded as too dangerous. To approach directly. The broader point, which mammoth cheese illustrates in miniature, is that Skyrim's economy is more interconnected and more interesting than its political conflicts make it appear. Trade moves through the holds continuously, along roads that armies periodically disrupt, and merchants inevitably find ways around. The same roads that carry soldiers also carry alchemical ingredients, from the Rift to buyers in Markarth, carry furs from Dawnstar's hunters to the tailors of Solitude carry. Salt and dried fish from the northern coast to the inland holds where the sea is something you have heard about but not visited. Dawnstar on the northern coast is a city that has been suffering from nightmares for as long as anyone in the hold can remember, though the specific cause of this communal dream disturbance becomes apparent over the course of a particular questline. The priest of Mara who arrives in town is addressing a genuine crisis, and his presence is received with a mixture of gratitude and the particular exhaustion of people who have been sleep deprived for long enough that they have stopped being surprised by unusual things. The city's location on the Sea of Ghosts gives it an economic character that is defined by the fishing industry and the trade that passes through its harbor. The Pale, the hold surrounding Dawnstar, is one of the harshest landscapes in a province not known for its gentleness, flat and wind exposed, and cold enough that the permafrost begins close enough to the surface that agriculture is essentially impossible. The people who live here have adapted accordingly, their economies structured around what the cold preserves and what the sea provides. Dawnstar's mine, Quicksilver Mine, produces one of the rarer ore types in Skyrim, used in certain smithing operations that require the specific properties of that metal. The miners who work it have the particular underground pallor of people who spend most of their daylight hours in a shaft, and they discuss the quality of different veins with. The precision of people for whom this knowledge has practical consequences. The Soul Cairn, accessible through the Dawnguard questline, is one of the more genuinely alien spaces in the game, a realm belonging to a group of ideal masters who are not Daedric princes in the conventional sense, but are rather something that became, through a process of transformation that did not end where they expected. The landscape of the Soul Cairn is bleak in the specific way that places defined by absence are bleak. Not violent absence, not angry, just the quiet of something that has been extracted from where it belonged. The souls that inhabit the cairn are there because soul gems that contain them were used in transactions with the ideal masters, and the cost of those transactions was exactly this: existence in a place that provides nothing the soul requires except continued existence. They move through the cairn in patterns that suggest habit without purpose, engaged in something that looks like life from the outside, but has lost the interior quality that makes life meaningful. Serana, who carries within her a particular kind of Elder Scroll and a particular kind of unlife, navigates both the soul cairn and the emotional implications of what it contains with a directness that makes her one of the most interesting companions in the game. Her history is specific, her opinions are legible, and her relationship to what she is involves a honesty that many characters who exist in less complicated circumstances do not manage. The Dawnguard themselves, the vampire hunters who form one half of the questline's central conflict, operate out of Fort Dawnguard, a location in the Eastern Rift that has been through several previous incarnations before becoming what it currently is. Isron, their leader, is a man of genuine conviction, operating at the edge of what conviction looks like before it becomes something less admirable. He is right about the threat. His certainty about the right way to address it and the right kind of people to trust in addressing it is less reliable. The vigilants of Stendarr, who are loosely affiliated with the same anti-supernatural mission, operate out of a hall in the Pale and have a broader mandate. They investigate and address manifestations of Daedric influence, undead presences, and other disruptions to what they consider the natural order. The Thalmor's relationship with the vigilants is complicated by the fact that Daedra worship and Talos worship have been legally conflated in imperial law in ways that the vigilants sometimes find themselves reluctantly enforcing. Stendarr himself, the divine of mercy and righteous rule and charity, is one of the less dramatically prominent members of the pantheon in terms of active storylines, but his presence is felt in the architecture of the holds, wayside shrines and spots where travelers have historically needed both rest and reassurance, small domestic altars and homes, where ordinary people have brought their private hopes for protection. The Atronachs that can be encountered throughout Skyrim, flame, frost, and storm varieties, are not native to the world. They are beings called from oblivion through magical operations, bound to a purpose by the conjurer who summoned them and existing in the mortal world in a state of permanent dislocation. The flame Atronachs in particular, with their constant burning, have a quality of being thoroughly themselves regardless of context. They do not wait. They do not adapt. They simply burn. The Conjuration school of magic deals with precisely these kinds of entities, the called and the bound, and also with the management of souls, which places it in a category of magical practice that the vigilants of Stendarr regard with particular concern. The ethical questions around conjuration are not novel within the world. They are debated in scholarly texts that are available throughout the province and occasionally referenced by NPCs with enough knowledge to have thought about them. A summoned Atronach in Skyrim follows its summoner with the particular loyalty of something that has been given a task and knows exactly what that task is. It does not have doubts about this. It does not have doubts about anything. There is in this a certain restfulness, not enviable necessarily, but comprehensible from the outside. The alchemy system of Skyrim encodes a vast amount of lore about the natural world in a form that is accessed through practical knowledge rather than scholarly reading. To understand which ingredients combine to produce which effects requires the kind of empirical investigation that mirrors, in miniature, the work of the natural philosophers and alchemists who produced the herbalism traditions that actual historical cultures developed. The blue mountain flower and the wheat that grow in the same meadow can be combined. The fly amanita mushroom near the swamp produces something that interacts with the hanging moss on nearby trees. The relationships are specific and earned. Nightshade, which grows in particularly high concentrations around Falkreath Cemetery, tells you something about the relationship between plant communities and the conditions of the soil beneath them. What nightshade is actually doing in that soil and what the soil is providing in return is not spelled out. But the distribution pattern suggests that the plant is adapted to conditions that the cemetery's particular soil chemistry provides, which is the kind of detail that rewards attention even if it is never made explicit. Hanging moss, which appears throughout Skyrim's caves and ruins, has multiple alchemical properties that reflect the traditional associations between moss species and the specific environments in which they thrive: damp stone, low light, places where growth happens slowly and patience is structural. There is something meditative about gathering alchemical ingredients in Skyrim's wilder spaces, moving through a landscape at the pace of attention rather than the pace of urgency. The enchanting system involves soul gems, receptacles for captured souls used to power magical objects, and this system has a lore layer beneath it that becomes more interesting the more carefully it is examined. The different sizes of soul gem correspond to different categories of soul, and souls in this framework are not identical things. A petty soul gem can hold the soul of a small creature, a grand soul gem can hold the soul of a person. The categories are not merely mechanical, they represent a cosmological understanding of what souls are and how they differ. The practice of soul trapping mortals, the filling of black soul gems with human or elven souls, is one of the more contested practices in Tamrielic magical ethics and texts. Found throughout Skyrim address the question with varying degrees of agreement. Some scholars treat it as simply another application of a magical principle, no different in kind from trapping a wolf's soul. Others regard it as a fundamental violation of what they understand souls to represent, the essential self of a person, which has a destination after death that soul trapping permanently disrupts. What happens to a soul and a gem that is then used to enchant an object is not clearly established in the available texts. The soul's energy is consumed. Whether what is consumed is everything, or whether something persists in a reduced form, is left deliberately open. This ambiguity is not a failure of the world's design, it is a feature of it. The enchanting table itself, which appears in various locations throughout the province, is an instrument that externalizes magical properties, taking an effect that might exist as a spell and embedding it into an object, where it continues to function according to the parameters of the embedding. The relationship between spell and enchantment is not identity. Something changes in the translation. Enchanted objects have a quality of persistence that spells lack, and they lose something of the caster's individual character in exchange. The arcane blacksmith tradition, which combines smithing and enchanting knowledge, exists in Skyrim's world as a recognized craft with its own practitioners and its own hierarchy of skill. The most accomplished practitioners can work with materials that require both physical expertise and a sensitivity to the magical properties of metal and hide and wood that most craftspeople do not develop. The crossover between these two skill sets is unusual enough to be notable. Orlund Greymane of Whiterun, who works at the Skyforge, an ancient stone forge whose heat source is not entirely conventional and whose output has historically been exceptional, represents this combination in practice. He does not make a point of discussing the forge's properties or his own understanding of them. He is simply very good at what he does, in the specific way that mastery looks when it has stopped needing to perform itself. The Skyforge is old in a way that the city around it is not. The companion's lore suggests that the forge predates the settlement of Whiterun, that the bird Cairn, divine aspect of wind and sky, made her nest there in some early age, and the site retains something from that presence. The forge's fire burns at a temperature that cannot be fully accounted for by the wood and coal being fed to it. The metal worked there has a quality that smiths from other locations have remarked upon without being able to specify exactly what distinguishes it. Nordic burial traditions involve, in the most significant cases, the interment of the dead within barrows, stone structures built into hillsides, sealed with puzzles and traps, that were designed to exclude the unworthy and have the secondary effect of excluding everyone after the first few generations of understanding pass away. The Draugr who inhabit these barrows are the persistent dead, not ghosts, not skeletons in the conventional sense, but the preserved bodies of ancient warriors animated by a force that is partly the will of Alduin and partly something native to the Nordic understanding of honor and obligation and the refusal to release the living from the consequences of the past. The Draugr retain fragments of the capabilities they possessed in life. The most powerful among them can use the Thuum, the voice that was once the exclusive property of dragons and then was spread to humanity through the teaching of Paarthurnax. This detail, easily missed in the press of combat, is significant. These are not merely animated corpses. They are the remnant of people who had genuine authority over language. Paarthurnax, the dragon who sits at the summit of the throat of the world and meditates on the nature of resistance and choice, is one of the most fully realized characters in the game. His history is not simple. He served Alduin during the Dragon War with a completeness that left marks. What he chose afterward, and what he has spent the millennia since then doing, is an extended answer to a question about whether nature is destiny. He teaches this through the Thuum and through conversation, the two methods available to him, with equal seriousness. He does not minimize what he was. He does not claim that what he is now erases it. What he offers instead is the actual example, not the argument that change is possible, but the living demonstration of it, sitting at the top of the world's highest mountain, surrounded by the wind that is his element, having chosen this particular form of existence because it is the one most likely to make the world slightly better than it would be otherwise. The Greybeards who live below him at High Hrothgar have taken a vow of near silence because the Thuum they carry is too powerful to deploy casually. When they speak, the sound moves the world. Arngir, who handles their communication with visitors, chooses his words with the specific care of someone who has learned that every word has physical consequences. High Hrothgar itself is a place of extreme quiet for reasons that are atmospheric before they are mystical. The altitude suppresses ordinary sound. The stone walls, built by 1,000 workers over 3 years in the First Era, according to the available records, are thick enough and arranged in ways that absorb rather than reflect. The wind outside is constant, but inside the monastery it arrives as a presence rather than a noise. The monk's daily practice involves working with the voice in controlled contexts, developing the patience to hold something powerful without deploying it, which is a different kind of skill from learning to use it. Most traditions of power development focus on application. The Greybeard's practice is more interesting. It is the cultivation of restraint, not as suppression, but as mastery, the ability to contain without struggle. Wulfgar, the youngest of the Greybeards, cannot speak to visitors because the force of his voice would be damaging at the distances involved in ordinary conversation. He communicates through Arngir and through gesture, and his silence in the main hall carries a different quality from the deliberate quiet of the older members. His is the silence of someone who has a great deal to say and has learned at significant cost exactly why that is not simple. The city of Solitude contains, in its Bard's College, the full text of the Poetic Edda of the Nords, or something very much like it, in the form of songs and ballads that students learn by heart and perform at the request of jarls and merchants and tavern owners throughout the province. The tradition of bardic preservation is older than writing in most cultures, and in Skyrim, where the oral tradition of the Nords predates their written records, the bards carry Information that the scholars of the College of Winterhold sometimes do not have access to in any other form. The specific songs that can be heard in Skyrim's taverns, Ragnar the Red, the Age of Aggression, the Age of Oppression, each encode a perspective on the province's current and historical situation that tells you something about the political and cultural context in which they were composed. Ragnar the Red is straightforwardly heroic in the mode of Nordic celebration of martial virtue and decisive failure. The Civil War songs, which exist in two versions depending on which side of the conflict is doing the singing, encode the same factual situation and the emotional frameworks of opposite interpretations. Music in Skyrim's taverns is not background decoration in the straightforward sense. The musicians who play in the Bannered Mare and the Bee and Barb and the Winking Skeever are doing something with economic and social and cultural function that is continuous with what bards have always done, making communal experience available in a form that can be carried from place to place. The Bannered Mare in Whiterun is one of those locations that serves as an anchor for a large number of the province's social transactions. It is a tavern in the practical sense, providing beds and food and drink, but it is also the place where a significant number of Whiterun's residents process the events of there, days in the company of others who are doing the same thing. Hulda, who runs it, knows the name of every regular customer and the outline of most of their current concerns, which is the specific expertise that good innkeepers develop over time. The economy of the average Skyrim tavern is more complex than it first appears. The beds, the food, the drink, the performances, each has a separate economic logic that combines into a single establishment. The safekeeping of goods for travelers, the messages passed through innkeepers from one hold to another, the introductions made between strangers who share a table, these are all services that taverns provide, whether or not anyone has put them on a menu. What the taverns provide for the documentary quality of Skyrim's world is a space where ordinary life is visible. The quarrels and the reconciliations, the gossip and the news, the specific texture of how people in this cold province relate to one another over shared warmth, these are the things that the major quest lines are too busy to pause for. The taverns hold still long enough to show them. The roads of Skyrim carry more than commerce. They carry information, and information in a world without reliable long-distance communication is a form of power. The Khajiit caravans that travel between the holds, always camping outside the city walls, always operating in the specific social position of known traders who are nonetheless not entirely trusted, are nodes in an information network as much as they are trade operations. They know what is happening in the holds they have recently visited, which is to say they know things that the holds they are currently visiting do not know yet. Khajiit in Skyrim occupy a particular social position that reflects a longer history of interaction between the cat people of Elsewhere and the more northerly cultures of Tamriel. The Nords of Skyrim's cities regard them with the specific wariness reserved for those who are entirely capable but also entirely outside the social structures that Nords used to. Assess trustworthiness. The Khajiit, for their part, have been navigating exactly this kind of reception for long enough that they have developed a professional equanimity about it. Morandru Joe, Karit, and the other caravan members each have their own histories and their own character beyond their commercial function, though the game reveals these. Histories in fragments rather than in complete form. What is clear in each case is that being a caravan member in Skyrim requires both the social skill to operate in a climate of low trust and the physical endurance to live. Outdoors through a Skyrim winter, neither of which is minor. The Dwemer ruins scattered throughout Skyrim are archaeological sites in the most literal sense, evidence of a civilization's material culture and the absence of the civilization itself. The automatons still operating within them are powered by some combination of soul gem technology and engineering principles that Skyrim's contemporary scholars have been able to study for years without fully replicating. The Dwemer understood something about the relationship between consciousness and mechanism that has not been independently rediscovered. Dwemer ruins are also some of the most dangerous locations in the province, which creates a particular archaeological situation. The evidence is there, but accessing it costs something. The Centurions, which are the largest and most capable of the surviving automatons, were clearly designed with a specific threat model in mind, though whether that threat model was external enemies or the ruin's own eventual occupants is not entirely clear from the available evidence. The Dwemer language, preserved in books and inscriptions throughout their ruins, has been partially deciphered, enough to understand the broad outlines of their intellectual tradition and the names and roles of their major scholars. Calshomo of Markarth is the province's foremost living expert on Dwemer language and culture, a status he maintains through decades of dedicated study and a fierce protectiveness of his research that occasionally shades into territorial behavior. Dwanzel, the Dwemer ruin beneath Markarth, is one of the larger excavated sites in Skyrim and one of the few where the Dwemer's domestic and civic architecture can be observed at something approaching its full scale. The expedition that went in ahead of the Dragonborn and did not return left behind a record of what they found, which is itself a document of discovery and then disaster. And reading it in the order it was written tells you something about the specific way that confidence in a particular place can erode. The pipes throughout Markarth above, which carry water and steam to various parts of the city, connect to the Dwemer system below, and this connection is one of the reasons the city functions as well as it does, given its stone construction and northern location. The Dwemer, whatever their failings, built infrastructure that outlasted them by 4 millennia, which is a form of legacy that is independent of any judgment about what they did, to the snow elves, or any other question about their moral character. Technology and ethics are separable in this way. The pipes work regardless of what you know about who built them. This is true in Skyrim's world, and it is true in the world outside of it. And sitting with that truth for a moment is one of those experiences that the best fictional worlds provide, not an answer, but a precise articulation of the question. The Hall of the Dead in each of Skyrim's major cities is tended by a priest of Arche, the divine who governs the transition between life and death and the sanctity of that transition in both directions. Arche's domain is not merely burial. It is the protection of the dead from those who would disturb the boundary between states, necromancers, vampires, anything that operates by refusing to honor what death is supposed to settle. The priests of Arche who tend these halls have a quiet authority that differs from the authority of priests in more dramatic religious contexts. They deal with grief, which is not a public performance even when it is witnessed. They deal with the practical management of bodies, which is not glamorous. They deal with the theological questions that arise when the dead do not stay where they have been placed, which in Skyrim arises more frequently than in most settings. Undurs in Whiterun, Runil and Falkreath Alessandra and Riften each carries the specific personality that develops when you spend years in the company of the recently bereaved and the long dead. They are not performatively gloomy. They are, without exception, calm. The work they do has given them a particular relationship with time that people in more dramatic occupations often do not develop. The mountains that form Skyrim's backbone, the throat of the world, the Draugr Mountains along the southern border, the Velothi Mountains in the east, are not simply landscape features. They are active participants in the province's climate and, more diffusely, in its culture. The passes through them, each of which has a name and a history, are the points through which the province maintains contact with the rest of Tamriel, and control of those passes has historically been a significant military and economic consideration. Helgen, the city where the game begins and which does not survive the opening, sits astride one such pass, the most direct route between Cyrodiil and Skyrim, which is partly why the executions were being held there, and partly why the dragon's attack on it had consequences that extended beyond the immediate destruction. Closing that pass, even temporarily, reshapes the flow of commerce and military communication between the provinces. The Jarl Mountains in winter are particularly impassable, which creates a seasonal rhythm to the province's relationship with the south. Certain goods, certain communications, certain movements of people become impossible or extremely costly for portions of the year, and this has shaped both the economy and the culture in ways that are not always made explicit, but are legible in the patterns of behavior the game presents. Helgen, after the dragon attack, becomes a place where the game's exploration rewards attention in a specific way. The physical evidence of what happened, the scorch patterns on the stone, the collapsed watchtower, the bodies that were not removed, tells the story of the attack in a form that can be read by anyone who enters afterward. The building where the player first takes shelter contains a bottle of mead that has been placed there specifically, an object with a personal history connected to a voice heard. At the beginning of the game, and the convergence of these two things in a burned city is quiet in exactly the way that Skyrim's best moments are quiet. The word Helgen itself means something in the Nordic language that the game uses for place names. It carries a root associated with sanctuary, a word for a protected place, which makes its destruction in the first minutes of the game a particular kind of irony that may or may not be intentional, but lands either way. What Helgen becomes after its destruction is a kind of archaeological site in real time, a place where travelers and scavengers and eventually bandits move in, each layer of new occupation adding itself to the evidence of what was there before. By the time the Dragonborn returns, if they return, the city is in the process of becoming something new, its original character preserved only in the stone itself and the objects that weren't taken. The Civil War questline involves a choice that is not as simple as Imperial or Stormcloak, though the game presents it initially in those terms. The Jarls of the various holds have their own positions on the conflict that are not always identical to the positions of the factions they nominally support, and the soldiers, who carry out orders on both sides, have individual personalities and concerns that the command structure they inhabit does not fully capture. Ulfric Stormcloak is a man whose stated ideals are considerably more complicated than his public presentation. He used the voice, the Thuum, the power of dragonborn speech, to kill the High King Torrig, which is an act that can be read as honorable combat in the Old Norse mode, or as an unfair advantage, depending on the cultural framework you bring to it. The game does not resolve this ambiguity for you. Both readings are present in the text. Tullius, the imperial general, is a professional military man who regards Skyrim with a combination of political understanding and cultural incomprehension that is entirely recognizable. He knows what he needs to accomplish. He is less certain about the texture of the place he is operating in, and this uncertainty occasionally produces friction with his more locally rooted subordinates. The companions that can travel with the Dragonborn through the province represent a particular cross-section of Skyrim's population. Followers come from every hold and every background: the warrior monk Marcurio from Riften, the nomadic tracker Aela from the Companions, the housecarls appointed by Jarls, the mercenary Janassa from Whiterun's tavern. Each of them has a history that is partially visible and a character that shows up in the way they respond to various situations. Mule the Lioness, who can be found in Riften, has a backstory involving a lost weapon and a personal mission that is slightly misaligned with the city she has chosen as her home. She despises the Thieves' Guild and everything it represents, and she says so in a city where the Thieves' Guild controls a significant portion of what happens, which requires either courage or a blind spot about consequences that the game leaves ambiguous. Cicero, the keeper of the Night Mother's coffin, who can be found on the road and later in the Brotherhood, is one of those characters who is written to be immediately irritating, and then, if you continue to pay attention, reveals himself to be fully comprehensible. His jester's affectation is not frivolity. It is the armor of someone who has spent a very long time in the company of the dead and needed to develop something to balance it. The orphanage in Riften Honor Hall, run by Grelad the Kind, whose name is ironic in both directions, is one of those places that the game includes without making it a major narrative focus, and which is more affecting for that restraint. The children within it are individually named and individually characterized, each with something to say about their situation that is specific to them rather than a generic expression of misery. What Grelod provides is technically shelter and technically supervision, which is the minimum required for something to be called an orphanage, and not considerably more. The choice the Dark Brotherhood storyline eventually offers regarding Honor Hall is one that the game handles with a moral ambiguity that is not false. The children are better off. The method of achieving this improvement involves a Daedric prince and the permanent elimination of a person. The game does not tell you how to feel about this. It provides the outcome, the method, and Aventus Aretino's specific grief for his lost mother and his specific determination to address an intolerable situation by the means available to him, and then it lets you carry what you carry. Kindness and cruelty in Skyrim's world are not always distributed to the people you would expect to find carrying them. The cook at the orphanage maintains a quiet kindness. The woman in charge does not. The children, who have had the most reason to give up on both, have maintained a kind of determined ordinary life within their constrained circumstances. The fishing spots along Skyrim's rivers and lakes represent a kind of everyday economy that the game usually presents in passing. The fishermen in the various holds do their work as part of the background texture of the province: the catch that arrives at the market in the morning, the conversations at the dock in the early light, the specific knowledge of where the water runs the right temperature and depth. This is not a profession that generates stories in the conventional sense. It generates food and income and the particular satisfaction of skilled work done reliably. The rivers themselves, the White River that runs through Winterhold, the Carth River through the Reach, the Treva River through the Rift, each have their own character and their own associated communities. The White River is gentle enough for swimming in the summer months, and in winter runs fast and cold and clear. The Carth runs through narrow gorges in the Reach, with a speed and force that has shaped the stone on either side over a period too long to meaningfully imagine. Water in Skyrim is not neutral. It carries information about the landscape it has moved through, the minerals from the Dwemer pipes in Markarth, the ash content in the rivers closest to the Morrowind border, the particular coldness of the streams that originate in glaciers above the snowline. The alchemists who use water in their preparations know this and choose their sources carefully. The lighthouse at Solitude, overlooking the Sea of Ghosts, serves a function that is both practical and symbolic. Ships coming from High Rock, from Hammerfell, from the distant shores of Akavir, where rumor places civilizations that Tamriel's historians know mostly through their invasions. All of them use the lighthouse's beam to orient themselves in the Northern Sea. The light is maintained through weather that would make most outdoor work impossible by keepers who have accepted this as the specific nature of their particular employment. The Sea of Ghosts is not a hospitable body of water. The cold that comes off it shapes the weather of the entire northern coast of Skyrim, and in the worst winter storms, ships that do not reach harbor in time become part of the seafloor archaeology that divers in later centuries would find, cargoes perfectly preserved in the cold water, carried in hulls that have been compressing into the sediment for generations. The sea preserves what it takes. East of Skyrim, the Atmoran connection, the homeland from which Iskramor and the 500 companions originally came, is a subject of some scholarly interest and considerable uncertainty. Atmora is a place that the available evidence suggests was once considerably warmer and considerably more populated. What happened to it is not clearly established, but the migration of the ancient Nords southward to Tamriel was not, in all probability, purely a matter of ambition. The Atmorans, who became the Nords, brought with them a mythology that was already old by the time they arrived in Skyrim, and the process of that mythology's encounter with the landscape it was transplanted into produced something that is neither purely Atmoran nor purely a product of Skyrim specifically. It is a negotiation visible in the texts that have survived, old stories that have been partially translated into the new land, with names and places adjusted to fit, and older elements that resisted adjustment and remain in the folklore as inexplicable features. The ancient Nord heroes whose tombs are found throughout Skyrim were real people who became legendary through a process that is itself part of what they left behind. The distinction between what Iskramor actually did and what the stories say he did is not fully recoverable, and at a certain point the distinction becomes less important than the way the stories have functioned as templates for aspiration, as frameworks for understanding difficulty, as the specific vocabulary of honor that Nordic culture uses to discuss what it means to act well. The tongue twisters and kennings that appear in Nordic poetry throughout the texts found in Skyrim's barrows and libraries encode a way of perceiving the world that is not fully translatable. The sea is the whale road, the sword is the wound snake, the sky is the tent of storms. Each of these compounds names its subject by its relationship to something else, which is a way of understanding things as embedded in a web of connections rather than as isolated objects with fixed identities. The giant spider population of Skyrim, the frostbite spiders that occupy caves and ruins throughout the province, represent something that the world has normalized, but which would, in any reasonable assessment, be extraordinary. These creatures are large enough to pose a genuine threat to armored individuals, yet they have established themselves as a standard hazard throughout the underground. Environments of Skyrim without any particular acknowledgement that this is unusual. The natural world of Skyrim is calibrated differently from the natural world of experience, and the spiders are one of the clearest examples of this calibration. The ice wraiths that float through Skyrim's snowfields, particularly in the more exposed northern regions, are beings whose relationship to physical matter is partial enough that conventional weapons affect them poorly. They are creatures of cold in the way that fire atronachs are creatures of fire, but without the history of having been summoned from somewhere else, the ice wraiths appear to be native, to have developed in the same landscape where they are encountered, adapted to conditions that most things do not survive. The saber cats that roam Skyrim's tundra and lower mountain slopes are a reminder that the megafauna of ancient environments left something of their ambition in the descendants that populate the world. They are big enough to threaten creatures that have no business being threatened by cats, and they pursue that threat with a directness that brooks no interpretation. There is no negotiation available with a saber cat that has decided you are in its space. The cave bears of Skyrim are animals that the world has never bothered to make manageable. They are larger than the brown bears that might serve as a comparison, with a density and solidity that translates into a physical presence that registers before you see them. Clearly, in the caves they inhabit, which they share, by the game's reckoning, with whatever else has moved in, they have established an ownership of the space that is total and non-negotiable. The bones near a cave bear's territory are not a warning in the conventional sense. They are simply the natural consequence of what happens when something encounters a cave bear without sufficient preparation. The wolves of Skyrim travel in packs that have a social structure legible enough to observe if you have the patience and the safety. The alphas of each pack command by weight and speed, and by a confidence that the rest of the group mirrors in their own movements. In the wilderness of Falkreath's forests, where the pines are thick enough that packs can shadow a traveler on the road for some distance before deciding whether to engage, this dynamic produces an atmosphere of evaluation, the sense that you are being assessed by something that knows the terrain considerably better than you do. The companion's questline involves a secret that changes the nature of the organization's inner circle in ways that are both practically significant and philosophically interesting. Lycanthropy, the condition of transforming between human and wolf form, is in the companion's tradition a gift from her scene taken voluntarily, not a curse in the folkloric sense, of something imposed from outside without consent. This distinction matters to the inner circle. It does not fully resolve the moral complexity of the situation, but it changes what that complexity is about. Ayla the Huntress of the Companions has a relationship with the beast blood that is the most fully examined in the quest line. She regards it not with ambivalence, but with clarity. It is what she is. It connects her to a tradition she values, and the prospect of losing it is not something she frames as liberation. Her perspective is not universally shared within the inner circle, which is what gives the quest line's central conflict its actual weight. The ritual that allows a werewolf to cure themselves involves the companion's most revered veterans, those who have passed into death carrying the beast blood who exist in Hersene's hunting grounds, and who can be freed from that existence in a trade. The fact that the cure involves an act of service to the dead rather than simply a mechanical reversal is the right kind of complication for a tradition that has always treated the choice carefully. The Thieves Guild's extended quest line involves a restoration of something that was lost, a reconnection with the source of the guild's historically reliable luck, which turns out to be a genuine metaphysical arrangement rather than a comforting story. This distinction between superstition and actual function is one that Skyrim handles well in several places, presenting things that look like folklore and turning out to be accurate descriptions of how something works. Mercer Frey, the guild's treasonous guildmaster whose history shapes the questline, is a character whose backstory involves an extraordinary level of self-interest pursued, consistently over a very long period. He is not a villain who became so through catastrophic moral failure. He is a professional who made a professional decision at some point and then spent years building a life that depended on that decision never being discovered. The patient accumulation of risk in that kind of life has its own particular psychology. Carlia, who was framed for a murder she did not commit and has spent decades in exile pursuing the evidence that would vindicate her, carries the specific patience of someone who has had very little to do except be right about something no one currently believes. Her relationship with the guild, the institution that tried to kill her, whose members pursued her, whose current leadership actively maintained the lie, is complicated by the fact that it is still the institution she belongs to. The artifacts of the Daedric princes are among the most powerful objects in Skyrim, and their distribution throughout the province is the result of each prince's decision to allow their artifact to interact with the mortal world through a specific questline. The nature of these questlines, the tasks required to obtain the artifact, tells you something about what each prince values and how they choose to demonstrate it. Mehrunes Razor, the artifact of the Prince of Change and Destruction, requires a journey through some of the more difficult locations in the province and culminates in an encounter with Mehrunes Dagon himself, who takes an interest in the proceedings in a very direct way. The artifact itself, a dagger that has a chance to instantly kill any target it strikes, encodes Mehrunes Dagon's philosophy in its function. Death is the ultimate change. The razor expresses this with complete efficiency. The ebony mail, Boethia's artifact, is awarded through a questline that requires the player to perform an act of betrayal, to sacrifice a follower. This requirement is not softened or made negotiable. Boethia is the prince of deceit and plots and the overthrow of authority, and the artifact is not given for competence in combat or cleverness in puzzle solving. It is given for the willingness to do something that most people would not willingly do, which is the specific quality Boethia's questline is designed to identify. Meridia, the Daedric Prince of Light, is one of the more unusual figures in the Daedric cosmology, a prince whose character is defined not by moral ambiguity, but by a genuine and specific hatred of the undead. Her opposition to Molag Bal and to necromancy is not a diplomatic position or a territorial dispute. It is an expression of something close to actual principle. The dead who walk when they should not are an offense to what she understands as the proper order of existence, and her artifact, Dawnbreaker, is designed specifically to address this problem. The quest to obtain Dawnbreaker involves restoring her statue on a mountain in the hold of Hoffingar, and her communication through the statue, her voice arriving through Anne. Object that shouldn't be producing sound has a quality that distinguishes her from the more conventional ways the Daedric princes choose to communicate. She is direct in a way that most of them are not, and this directness extends to the artifact itself, which does exactly what it is described as doing without any of the complications that attend most Daedric artifacts. The undead that Dawnbreaker destroys are not, in Meridia's framework, victims of the weapon. They are beings in a wrong state, occupying an existence they should not be occupying, and the weapon's action is corrective rather than destructive. Whether this framing is accurate or simply convenient is left, as most things in Skyrim's theological landscape are left, as a question rather than an answer. The Mages Guild that existed in earlier eras of Tamrielic history has been replaced, in Skyrim's time, by the College of Winterhold as the primary institutional structure for magical education in the North. The reasons for this transition are partly political and partly the result of events in Cyrodiil during the Oblivion Crisis, which disrupted many of the mages' guilds established. Operations and created conditions in which the guild structure was difficult to maintain. The college's curriculum, glimpsed through the quest line and the NPC scholars who inhabit it, covers the major schools of magic, destruction, illusion, alteration, conjuration, restoration, and enchanting, with a scholarly rigor that is distinct from the more practical approach to magic that most of Skyrim's independent practitioners take. The college is interested in understanding the principles that underlie magical operation, not merely in the application of effects that have been confirmed to work. Feralda, who tends the bridge to the college and who evaluates applicants before allowing them to cross, embodies this distinction in the specific quality of her assessment. She is not checking whether you can do a spell, she is checking whether you understand what you are doing. The difference between these two things is the difference between competence and scholarship, and the college is interested in the latter. The illusion school of magic involves effects on perception and consciousness that raise questions that the game generally does not stop to address. The calm spell, which reduces a creature or person's aggression, is doing something to the target's internal state, not merely changing their behavior, but influencing the experience behind the behavior. The frenzy spell does the inverse. The fury that sends a person into murderous aggression is not creating a new person, it is amplifying something that was already present and directing it without the targets. Knowledge or consent. Invisibility, the illusion effect that renders the caster undetectable to normal senses, works in Skyrim by altering what others perceive, rather than by physically removing the caster from the space. The caster is still there. The light and sound that would normally betray their presence are being managed in a way that the spell maintains for a period. Experienced guards in some locations have learned to respond to sounds and contextual information even in the absence of a visible source, which is the correct response to Anne. Environment where illusion magic is a known quantity. The quiet casting perk in the illusion tree, which makes all spells from all schools silent when cast, represents the kind of cross-school application that the game rewards players for noticing. Magic in Skyrim is not rigidly compartmentalized. The schools represent categories of effect, not categorical limits on what can be achieved through their combination. The Restoration School, which governs healing and the management of magical and undead energies, has a reputation within the game's world for being the least prestigious of the Schools. Farengar's Secret Fire in Whiterun's Dragon's Reach mentions this with a dry acknowledgement that suggests it is a position he does not fully share, but has internalized as a social fact. The ability to undo damage is less legible as power than the ability to cause it, which is a bias that persists in most cultures that have had to navigate the politics of power. The healing spells work, in Skyrim's lore, by accelerating the body's natural processes rather than simply overriding them. The restoration tradition understands what is supposed to be happening in a living body and provides the magical energy to make it happen faster than the body could manage alone. This framing makes restoration magic genuinely interesting in a way that a simpler description of healing would not. It implies that practitioners of restoration have to understand anatomy and physiology in a fairly sophisticated way, turn undead, which sends lower-level undead fleeing, and the more powerful effects that destroy them outright function by exploiting the opposition between the animating force in undead creatures and the positive energy that restoration magic channels. This is not merely a game mechanic. Within the world's framework, it is an expression of a genuinely cosmic tension, the same opposition that defines Meridia's character expressed through a school of magic that the college's least acclaimed practitioners have quietly mastered. The books found throughout Skyrim range from single-sheet pamphlets to multi-volume scholarly texts, and the quality and character of the writing varies as much as you would expect from a collection representing an entire civilization's literary output. The adventure stories, the adventures of Berenzia, the tales of various heroic figures, are pitched at an entertainment audience and carry the specific pleasures of genre. Fiction. The scholarly texts are dense and specialized and assume a level of prior knowledge that most readers do not have. The lusty Argonian maid, which appears in bookstores and personal collections throughout Skyrim with a frequency that suggests genuine popularity, is a comedic text that the game includes partly for its own humor and partly because a world without comedic literature would be less convincing than a world with it. The fact that this particular text has survived and circulated while some of the lore texts are hard to find in single copies tells you something about how the book economy works, in the same way it works outside of games. Shalador's insights are magical texts scattered through the province, each one containing magical knowledge that enhances the reader's capacity in a particular school. The character of Shalador himself, an archmage of legendary capacity who left behind more work than any single institution could fully catalog, exists as a presence throughout the scholarly texts of Skyrim without ever appearing in person. He is fully present as a historical force, felt through the documents and locations associated with them. The Black Books of Hermaeus Mora, which are accessible through the Dragonborn DLC, are objects that exist in a category between physical text and portal. To read them is to enter Apocrypha, the Daedric realm of the Prince of Knowledge and Fate, and what happens to a reader there depends on both what they brought with them and what they are willing to become. Hermaeus Mora does not offer knowledge for free. He offers knowledge in exchange for knowledge, and the knowledge he takes is specific and personal and not always clearly articulated before the exchange. Apocrypha as a space is one of the more fully realized Daedric realms in the game, an infinite library of tentacles and poisonous waters and chapters that lead to more chapters. The physical expression of what happens when the accumulation of knowledge is pursued as an absolute value without any other principle to balance it. Everything that has been written is here in principle, including things that should not have been written, and things that are writing themselves now. Miraak, the first Dragonborn, is the central antagonist of the Dragonborn DLC, and his history is the most extended illustration available of what the dragon aspect can become, when divorced from the responsibilities the gift implies. He learned everything the dragons could teach him, and then used that knowledge to pursue his own agenda, which required the kind of scale that even the Dragonborn's power cannot achieve without external assistance, the assistance Hermaeus Mora provided, and whose terms are now visible in the form Miraak has taken. Solstheim, the island where the Dragonborn deal takes place, is a space between Skyrim and Morrowind, politically assigned to Morrowind's administration, geographically attached. To neither, culturally a layering of Nordic and Dwemer traditions over the indigenous Skal community. The Skal are a people whose relationship to the natural world of the island is more intimate and more reciprocal than the relationship most other cultures maintain with their landscapes. Their tradition involves a dialogue with the land that is not metaphorical. The Allmaker stones that circle the island's inhabited areas are focal points for this tradition, places where the forces that the Skal understand as fundamental to existence are most legible. When these stones are corrupted, the corruption is not merely atmospheric. It represents something happening to the actual exchange between the Skal and the island they have maintained a relationship with for generations too numerous to count. Individually, the Skal village, in its architectural character and its community dynamics, represents a way of living that is adapted entirely to Solstheim's specific conditions, the ash, that drifts from Red Mountain across the water, the cold that comes off the northern sea, the specific plants and animals that can survive in the combination of these pressures. Their knowledge of local ecology is precise and practical, and held communally rather than specializing in the way that more stratified societies tend to specialize knowledge. The ash that covers the southern portion of Solstheim, deposited by Red Mountain's eruption, has created an environment that is technically hostile and practically inhabited. Raven Rock, the Dwemer settlement on the island's southern coast, exists in this ash landscape with a particular resourcefulness of people who had nowhere else to go and have made peace with this as their home. The ebony mining operation that originally brought the East Empire Company to the island has long since dried up, but the community remains, sustained by a combination of determination and the Dwemer tradition of making do with whatever the landscape provides. Counselor Morvain and his bodyguard Adril Arano manage Raven Rock with a combination of ceremonial authority and genuine concern for the population that carries them through. Situations where the authority alone would not be sufficient. The challenges the town faces, the dried mine, the ash spawn that occasionally emerge from the landscape to attack, the distance from Morrowind's mainland support require a kind of ongoing improvisation that the formal structures of House Whiterun are not entirely designed to accommodate. The Temple of Miraak, which emerges from the ash as the questline progresses, is a physical expression of the hold that Miraak's will has maintained over the island even through his long confinement in Apocrypha. The construction that happens there, driven by the island's inhabitants in a state that is not quite voluntary and not quite unconscious, is one of those images that stays, the specific form that compulsion takes when it is old enough to have developed its own architecture. The tome's 11 main shouts, plus the various shouts added through the Delk, each have a 3-word structure that reflects the principle that more words of power equal more developed capacity. The first word of any shout is functional but limited. The second adds both power and precision. The third achieves the full expression of what that shout is, and the decision of when to use 2 words versus 3 is genuinely tactical in a way that most power systems in. Fantasy games are not. Unrelenting force, the first shout most players learn, is the distilled expression of the physics of intention, the voice pushing reality to match what it insists is true. The third word, the one learned at the High Hrothgar's courtyard with the Greybeards, extends the shout into something that can clear a hallway in a way that remains impressive. Regardless of how many times you have seen it, it does not diminish with familiarity. Slow time, Tid Clo Ul, is perhaps the most conceptually interesting of the available shouts, because what it is doing in the world's own framework is not merely a gameplay. Convenience. It is the voice insisting that time behave differently in the space around the speaker. Time in Skyrim's cosmology is not a fixed constant. It is an aspect of the world that exists within the influence of powerful enough speech. The shout does not cheat. It operates within the rules of a reality that has rules like this. Dragon souls, which the dragonborn absorbs when a dragon is killed, are not merely power sources in the conventional sense. They are the totality of what a dragon was, its memories, its understanding, its specific relationship to the Thuum. When the dragonborn absorbs a dragon's soul, they are receiving the accumulated experience of a being that may have existed for thousands of years. The word walls that teach shouts contain the specific encoding of knowledge, but the dragon souls contain something less structured and more complete. This has implications for the character of the dragonborn that the game does not make fully explicit. The Thuum improves not merely because words are learned, but because the capacity to use them grows through the absorption of those who mastered them. A dragonborn who has absorbed many dragon souls is not the same person as the one who absorbed none in ways that go deeper than combat effectiveness. The Dova, who return to life after the dragonborn passes through the world, who climb from their burial mounds and speak in the language that reality responds to, are not randomly distributed. They emerge where they were buried, at sites chosen centuries ago, in holds that have had to adjust to the reality that dragons are something that now happens again. The guards in Whiterun discussing the attack on the western watchtower are not performing panic. It is the first time in living memory that something the stories described as historical has become immediate. The economy of Skyrim as a whole, the way gold moves between holds, between factions, between the various vendors and craftspeople and service providers, reflects a world in which the political divisions the Civil War is creating have economic consequences that are not evenly distributed. The merchants and holds that have changed hands recently have had to navigate the transition, different soldiers at the gate, different requirements for operating licenses, different relationships between the hold's economy and the imperial trade networks. The barter system that governs most transactions in Skyrim is not purely monetary. Alchemical ingredients, manufactured items, raw materials, all of these trade as goods in a system where the coin exists but has its own supply constraints. The septum, the standard currency of the empire, carries on its face the image of the emperor, and the persistence of imperial currency in Stormcloak controlled holds during the Civil War tells you something about the gap between political allegiance and economic necessity. The pickpocketing economy, the shadow commerce that runs alongside the official one, has its own logic and its own practitioners. The Thieves Guild provides infrastructure for this, in the sense of fencing services and training, but the actual work is done by individuals making individual assessments of risk and reward in each specific situation. The most experienced practitioners in the game's world have developed an ability to read a crowd that has been refined by the specific consequences of being wrong. The Companion's Jorvasker hosts regular mealtimes at which the various members, Shield Brothers and Shield Sisters, Inner Circle and Outer, share food and argue about things that people in warrior cultures argue about: superiority in combat, the justice of various actions, the direction the organization should take on questions that have no obvious military resolution. These conversations are fragments of a culture that uses martial context as the primary framework for discussing almost everything, and what emerges from them is not a simple or monolithic view, but a range of opinions held with the specific conviction of people who have tested themselves against difficult situations and know something about what they are capable of. Tilma, who tends the Companion's Hall and has done so for long enough that her presence has become structural rather than biographical, is the kind of character that a less careful world would have forgotten to include. She has no questline. She holds no position in any hierarchy. She knows where everything is and what it costs, and how long the last batch of food will last, and the Companion's operation would be meaningfully different without her in a way. That would only become apparent if she left. The sleeping arrangements at Jorvasker, the upturned ship filled with sleeping warriors, and their weapons, and their various personal complications, is one of those domestic details that humanizes an institution that could easily become purely a delivery mechanism for quests. People sleep here. They wake up with sore backs and bad dreams and opinions about how loudly other people snore. The rivers that the Dragonborn crosses on roads between holds cross under bridges that have in some cases been standing for longer than the roads themselves. Bridge construction in Skyrim required an engineering sophistication that is not always attributed to Nordic culture and its popular imagination, but the evidence is there in the stone, courses of masonry that have survived both weather and war, foundations driven into riverbeds that have shifted around them without moving them, arches that demonstrate an understanding of compressive force that does not require advanced mathematics to discover, but does require the patience to find through experimentation. The ancient roads that predated Nordic settlement, laid down during the Merethic era by the snow elves, are visible in certain places as a slightly different quality of the ground, stones that are not quite the same as the surrounding geology, patterns in the way the path holds up against weather that suggest deliberate engineering. These roads were built for a civilization that no longer exists along them, and the Nords who now travel them do so without any particular awareness of whose roads they are. The road from Riverwood to Helgen that the Dragonborn takes at the very beginning of the game, before any of the province's complications have become fully visible, is a road through some of the most conventionally beautiful landscape in Skyrim, river and forest and mountain, and a combination that most people, encountering it, feel something about, that they may not immediately have language for. It is the experience of arriving somewhere that feels familiar before you know why. The twilight hours in Skyrim, the period between the sun setting behind the mountains and the full darkness of night, have a particular color that the game reproduces with some fidelity. The light in the Reach at this hour, when the mountains on the western edge are blocking the sun, but the sky above is still catching it, produces a purple-gray cast over. everything that the residents of Markarth have lived with for so long that they no longer consciously register it. Visitors always do. The aurora borealis that appears in Skyrim's night sky, called the Lights of Magnus in some Nordic texts, attributed to the eye of a god in others, is in the worlds. Cosmological framework, a visible manifestation of the magical energy that flows through the world from the stars. The stars in Skyrim's understanding are not what they appear to be. They are not simply distant lights, but punctures in the membrane between the mortal world and the realm of magic, points where the energy that enables magical practice flows through most readily. This framing makes the night sky in Skyrim both beautiful and structurally significant, which is a combination that the best world building achieves, the aesthetic and the meaningful being the same thing rather than separate layers applied to each other. To look at the aurora is to look at the infrastructure of magic made visible, and knowing this does not diminish how it looks. The ancient burial practices of the Nords were not uniform across all of Skyrim's many centuries of settlement. Different eras and different holds produced different approaches to what should happen to a person after life, what they should be given for the journey, what should be left with them, and what relationship the living should maintain with where the dead were placed. The Draugr barrows that dot the province represent one tradition, and the more modest cairns along the roads represent another, and the Hall of the Dead in each city represents a later synthesis of these various approaches into something that the imperial religious administration could recognize and work with. The most ancient barrows predate Nordic settlement itself in some cases, built by peoples whose relationship to the land preceded the Atmoran migration by enough time that their architecture and their purposes have become genuinely obscure. When Nord burial practices occupied these already existing structures, they brought their own dead into spaces that had been consecrated by others for reasons that were no longer fully understood. This layering of meaning, the new sacred on top of the old sacred, separated by a threshold of time that no one currently alive can cross, is one of the things that makes Skyrim's underground spaces feel genuinely ancient rather than merely designed to seem so. The grave goods found in the oldest chambers, weapons and armor of craft quality that has not been matched by contemporary smithing, personal items whose function is not always obvious, containers of food and drink that have long since turned to something other than what they were, represent the specific logic of a culture that believed the dead would need these things where they were going. The belief was not metaphorical. The food was real food. The weapons were sharp. The relationship between Skyrim's economy and its political situation creates pressures that appear most clearly at the borders between holds. A merchant traveling from the imperial city of Solitude to the Stormcloak-held city of Windhelm must pass through multiple hold borders, each of which is administered by people who are currently on opposite sides of a civil war, and each of which has its own interpretation of what taxes or duties are appropriate. The paperwork involved, if it existed in explicit form, would be considerable. What this means in practice is that certain goods become expensive or unavailable in certain holds depending on the state of the roads and the allegiances of the people who control them. The alchemical ingredient markets in different cities reflect this. Solitude's radiant raiment can source things that Windhelm's market cannot, and vice versa, and the price. Differential for common goods between holds on opposite sides of the civil conflict is not merely a matter of distance. The innkeepers, who serve as informal postal services throughout the province, holding messages for travelers, passing news between holds, are one of the Civil War's most interesting civilian populations. They cannot afford to take sides because their business depends on serving whoever walks through the door, and in Skyrim's current situation, whoever walks through the door is unpredictable in their allegiances. The practiced neutrality of experienced innkeepers is a survival skill as much as a professional courtesy. The forges of Skyrim represent different metalworking traditions that have developed in different parts of the province in response to different available materials and different cultural priorities. The Nordic forge tradition produces weapons and armor that prioritize durability and function, the specific requirements of a cold climate, and a culture where physical confrontation is a realistic part of daily life. The Elven tradition, represented by smiths trained in techniques from the Somerset Isles, produces objects of greater refinement and somewhat different balance, lighter, more precise, optimized for a different kind of body, moving in a different kind of way. The Orcish tradition, found in the strongholds that dot the province's wilderness, where orcs live under the law of Malakath and maintain a governance structure that outsiders, frequently misread as lawlessness, produces armor of particularly high density and raw protective capacity, trading aesthetic refinement for the ability to take a great deal of damage before failing. The orcs who live in Skyrim's strongholds are not refugees in the same sense that the Dwemer are refugees. They have chosen this form of life, and the strongholds represent not a settling for less but a particular vision of what enough is. The Daedric smithing tradition, the creation of weapons and armor using materials drawn from oblivion, worked with techniques that require an understanding of magical theory as much as physical craft produces the most capable objects available through ordinary means. The ebony that provides the base material for Daedric equipment is a volcanic glass of exceptional density found in highest concentrations in Morrowind but present in smaller deposits elsewhere, including on Solstheim. The orc strongholds of Skyrim, Dushnik Yal, Largashbur, Morkazgur, Narzulbur are each distinct communities within a shared cultural framework, each with their own current, chief in their own current challenges. The law of Malakath governs through challenge and consequence. Authority is held by whoever can successfully defend it, and the obligations of that authority are specific and enforced. An orc chief who fails in those obligations faces a challenge that is not procedural but physical, and the outcome of that challenge determines who leads next. This governance structure looks, from outside, like pure strength worship, and orcs in Skyrim's world have largely stopped correcting that interpretation, because correcting it requires the kind of extended conversation that most people coming through with prejudice already formed are not interested in having. The actual picture is considerably more nuanced. The law of Malakath involves obligations that run in both directions, chiefs who are protected by the law but also constrained by it, and a tradition of communal survival in conditions that more comfortable peoples have not had to navigate. Malakath himself, the Daedric prince, whose domain is the spurned and the ostracized, the wronged and the accursed, has a history that is more specific than his domain might suggest. He is the transformed remnant of a Daedric prince whose original character was entirely different, changed through an act of violence into what he now is. This transformation is not something he has moved past. It is constitutive of what he is, and the community of orcs who follow him are, in this framework, a mirror of what he represents, people whom the world has treated as less than. They are who have built something of their own regardless. The roads between the strongholds, which the orcs know with the precision of people who have traveled them in all weather conditions for generations, connect to the broader road. Network of Skyrim through paths that are not always marked on the maps available to travelers from the holds. This unofficial geography, the routes that locals know and outsiders miss, is one of the ways that Skyrim's wilderness maintains its character as genuinely wild rather than fully documented. There are places in the Reach where a traveler can spend 3 days without encountering a sign or a waystone, navigating by the quality of the stone underfoot and the direction of the water's flow. The Forsworn occupy much of this unmapped territory in the Reach, and their intimate knowledge of it is one of their primary tactical advantages. The camps they maintain shift seasonally in response to both military pressure and the requirements of the Reach's ecology, following the availability of certain plants and animals that their traditions require. The Harpies of the Reach, which appear in the lore as creatures associated with the Reekman's magical practices, occupy high rocky terrain that is difficult to approach from. Below, which gives them a surveillance advantage that the Forsworn have learned to use. The Briarheart warriors, Forsworn who have undergone a transformation involving the replacement of their heart with a Briarheart plant through a ritual that costs them their humanity in exchange for considerable power, are the most dramatic example of what the Forsworn's magical tradition can produce. The ritual is not reversible. The person who emerges from it carries forward the memories and the loyalties of who they were, but the interior of the chest is changed, and this change is total. The College of Winterhold's library, which is maintained by Urag Groshub with the specific devotion of someone who has decided that this is the most important thing in the world and has organized his life accordingly, contains texts that exist in no other institutional collection in the province. Some of them were given, some were purchased. Some were acquired in ways that the college's official history describes in terms that are slightly vague. The collection covers magical theory, historical records, travelers' accounts of distant places, theological speculation, natural philosophy, poetry, and categories that do not fit cleanly into any of these. Urag Groshub himself, an orc in an institution that is already regarded with suspicion by most of Skyrim's Nord population, occupies a position that requires a particular kind of daily navigation. The scholar's devotion to the texts, combined with the practicalities of being an individual in a context where individuals are sometimes read before they speak. His protectiveness of the collection is not possessiveness. It is the specific care of someone who understands what is lost when books are lost, and has decided that preventing this is a reasonable allocation of a life. The Dwemer texts in the collection, which Calchelmo of Markarth sometimes requests access to, are among the most valuable scholarly resources available, primary sources from a civilization that exists otherwise only in ruins and in what those ruins contain. Reading them requires facility in a language that perhaps 20 living scholars can manage with any reliability, and the process of that reading is slow enough that the knowledge produced by it accumulates over careers rather than projects. The seasonal variation in Skyrim's weather is severe enough to constitute a genuine force in the province's life. the transition from the relatively mild late summer to the full winter of Skyrim's northern holds, a transition that happens over the course of perhaps 4 weeks of calendar time, requires communities to make specific preparations that represent a significant portion of the year's organizational energy. Food storage, firewood, the sealing of structures against drafts that in summer are breezes and in winter are threats. All of this represents labor that the spring to summer period generates surpluses to support. The Nords of Skyrim have a detailed vocabulary for winter weather that reflects the amount of attention they have paid to its variations over generations. The difference between a frost that comes off the Sea of Ghosts and a frost that comes down from the throat of the world is legible in the quality of the cold. Different moisture contents, different accompanying winds, different effects on the body and on the crops that are still in the ground when it arrives. People who live in cold places develop this vocabulary because the distinctions it encodes are practically significant. The summer in Skyrim, when it comes, is short and occasionally brilliant, the tundra grasses flowering in a period of growth that is compressed by the short window of warm temperatures into something almost urgent. The wildflowers that alchemists gather during this window, blue mountain flowers, purple mountain flowers, the various herbs and fungi, are at their most potent in the immediate aftermath of the spring melt, when the soil is rich with what the snow preserved and the plants are racing to make the most of the available warmth. The followers who carry the Dragonborn's excess belongings are performing a logistical service that has its own particular labor economics. The capacity of a follower to carry items is not unlimited, and the informal economy of service that the follower relationship represents, the follower's fighting capability and carrying capacity in exchange for the Dragonborn's protection and presumably some share of the rewards, is a version of a structure that appears throughout Skyrim's economy in various forms. The housecarls in particular, the personal guards appointed by jarls as both service and honor, have a relationship to the Dragonborn that is explicitly feudal in its structure. Loyalty in exchange for service, in a direction that runs both ways. The housecarls are not merely guards. They are expressions of the Hold's investment in the Dragonborn's success, and their appointment is a public statement about where the Jarl has chosen to place the Hold's trust. Lydia, who becomes the first housecarl most players acquire, has achieved a particular kind of cultural afterlife outside the game itself, as a figure whose specific complaint about carrying a burden has become a shorthand for a particular kind of resigned service that resonates far beyond its original context. This is the kind of accidental cultural significance that fictional worlds generate when they hit something true, the specific combination of loyalty and complaint that Lydia encodes is recognizable in a way that outlasts its particular fictional frame. The crafting stations distributed throughout Skyrim, forges and workbenches and tanning racks and smelters and cooking pots, represent an entire layer of the provinces. Economic activity that operates at the individual rather than the institutional level. A person with access to a forge and the right materials can produce objects that have genuine value in the Hold's economy and the existence of this individual productive. Capacity gives a particular character to the province's relationship with labor. The tanning racks in particular occupy an interesting position in this economy. They represent the interface between Skyrim's hunting economy, which produces raw hides, and the manufacturing economy that converts those hides into armor and clothing and goods of various other kinds. The hunters who bring hides to the tanning racks are one node in a supply chain that ends with the merchants who sell finished leather goods in the city markets. The cooking system in Skyrim encodes nutritional logic that is not always obvious at first, but reveals itself on examination. Vegetable soup and other prepared foods produce effects on stamina and health regeneration that raw ingredients do not, which is the correct way to represent the difference between unprocessed and processed food in terms of their utility. The recipes that exist in the game's cookbook, distributed in various inns and houses, represent a culinary tradition that is specifically adapted to the ingredients available in a cold northern province. The companion's history with the Daedric prince's touches through her scene on the broader question of what it means to enter into an agreement with a being whose interests are genuinely different from yours and who honors the agreement as stated without any obligation to be fair in how it is stated. The blood pact that Kodlak Whiteman sought to break before his death was not one he chose. It was inherited from predecessors who made the choice, and what he was trying to do was find a way to honor his own religious commitments despite a prior obligation he had no voice in creating. This question of inherited obligation, the responsibility that comes to you not through your choices, but through the choices of those whose position you have assumed, is one that the game handles in several places, and that the companion's questline handles with particular directness. The werewolves of the Inner Circle did not all choose this in exactly the same way with exactly the same information and exactly the same circumstances. What they share is the present reality and the question of what to do with it going forward. Vilkas and Farkas, the twin brothers of the companions, represent this shared reality with a characterological difference that is established quickly and maintained consistently. Vilkas is the thinker, the one who has spent the most time sitting with what the beast blood means and the context of what he believes about the world and where he wants to end up. Farkas is the actor, the one for whom the practical questions of what needs doing today are more immediately present than the metaphysical questions of what this means in the long run. Both approaches are reasonable, both have costs. The city of Winterhold, which exists now as essentially a village, a few buildings clinging to the edge of the cliff that the Great Collapse left behind, preserves in its diminished form a memory of what it was before the disaster. The Jarl Courier governs a hold whose primary resource is the college that most of his subjects distrust, and the political situation this creates is one that requires a particular kind of management. He is not entirely wrong in his suspicions. He is not entirely right in where he directs them. The survivors of the Great Collapse who remained in Winterhold, or whose descendants remained, have maintained a relationship with the cold and the reduced circumstances that has given them a particular character. They are not defeated people. They are people who decided to stay in a place that most people decided to leave, and the decision to stay in a difficult place, made and remade each season, produces a specific kind of rootedness that is not available to those who left for somewhere easier. The lighthouse on the eastern edge of Winterhold, overlooking the ice-choked waters of the Sea of Ghosts, has its own quiet history, separate from the college and the city. The keeper of a lighthouse in this location has the specific job of maintaining a signal through conditions designed to extinguish signals and the accumulated history of that. Work is present in the structure itself, repairs made to the original construction, each layer representing a winter survived. The northern lights above Winterhold visible on clear nights when the aurora is active, have a particular intensity in this location that is partly altitude and partly the clarity of the air in a place where there is very little smoke or light from human activity to dilute what the sky is doing. The scholars of the college who happen to look up from their texts on such evenings, which some of them do, and some of them have developed the habit of not doing, because looking up from texts has a way of turning into a long time lost in something other than the immediate project, sometimes find their research redirected by what they see. The relationship between scholarship and wonder is one that the College of Winterhold handles in its own quiet way. The students who come to the college come for various reasons, some for power, some for knowledge as an end in itself, some because they have demonstrated a magical capacity that their home communities have not known how to accommodate. What the college can offer all of them is a place where the thing they are is not unusual. This is not a minor offering. On Mund, Jazargo, Berlina, Marion, the three students who arrive at the college in the same general period as the Dragonborn, each carry a history that their presence in this cold northern institution expresses without always articulating directly. What the college means to each of them is not identical, and watching them navigate the same institution from their different starting points is one of the more quietly illuminating activities available in the game's early hours. The slow fade of evening in Skyrim begins hours before the sun actually sets, because the mountains take the light before the horizon does. A traveler on the road between Whiterun and Riverwood in the late afternoon will watch the peaks of the mountains to the west light up in gold while the valley below them goes into a premature gray, and the temperature will drop with the shadow in a way that is felt immediately on any exposed skin. This is when most experienced travelers begin looking for shelter if they have not already found it. The inns of Skyrim, scattered along the roads at intervals that suggest some planning but not a comprehensive system, are not identical. Each reflects the character of its location and its keeper, the sleeping giant inn in Riverwood with its particular domestic quality, the Four Shields Tavern in Dragon Bridge, with its view of the ancient span across the Carth River, the Moorside Inn in Morthal, with its atmosphere of a community that keeps to itself and has reasons for doing so. Each has a fire, each has beds, each has someone behind the bar who knows more than they say and says more than they have to. The Moorside Inn in Morthal sits in a town that is not comfortable in any straightforward sense. The marsh surrounding Morthal has a quality that the light does not improve, flat and gray and present in a way that more dramatic landscapes are not. The kind of landscape that settles into your awareness rather than demanding it. The people of Morthal are accustomed to this. They are less certain about many other things that are currently happening in their town, and they express this uncertainty in the tight closed way of people who do not know which pieces of the trouble are safe to discuss with strangers. The history of the Thieves' Guild in Riften is longer than the guild's current membership usually acknowledges, because acknowledging it would require acknowledging that the institution they are part of has not always been what it currently is, that it has passed through periods of genuine power and periods of compromised function, and that the current period is of the latter kind. The Skeleton Key's absence is not an abstraction. It is felt in the specific quality of the guild's luck, the way small things go wrong that should not, the contracts that go sideways in ways that experienced guild members find puzzling. What makes the guild interesting as an institution is that it has its own internal culture, its own mythology, its own code of conduct, its own understanding of what members owe each other and what the institution owes its members, that persists through its current difficulties without being explained or justified by them. The thieves' honor, the strictures against killing and targeting the poor, is not merely a set of rules, it is an expression of what the guild understands itself to be, even in periods when that understanding is more aspiration than practice. Delvin Mallory, who operates out of the Ragged Flagon in Riften's Ratway, is one of those characters who has arrived at exactly where they intended to be through a combination of skill and decision and some amount of luck, and who has made peace with this in a way that is fully visible in how they occupy a space. He is at home in the Ratway. The Ratway is comfortable for him. This is not a small thing. The Dragonborn's relationship to the province they move through is in some sense always a tourist relationship. They arrive at each place knowing nothing specific about it, and learn what can be learned in the time available before the quest line moves them elsewhere. But the province is designed in a way that rewards the traveler who moves slowly, who departs from the road, who goes into the building that does not have a quest marker above it. The abandoned house in Markarth, which is not abandoned in the way abandoned buildings usually are, rewards exactly this kind of lateral attention. The farmsteads outside the main city boundaries, where the actual agricultural work that keeps the holds fed takes place, and where the Civil War's disruptions are felt most. Immediately are places that the quest lines pass through without stopping at for long. The character of life in those farmsteads is present in the quality of their buildings, the items on the tables, the tools near the doors. Sleeping at a campsite in Skyrim's wilderness, where the well-rested bonus accrues and the night passes quickly and the weather continues outside the bedroll, is one of those experiences that the game provides without making it a narrative point. The practical mechanics of rest combine with the particular location to produce something that is its own small experience, separate from whatever quest brought you to this part of the map. This is what open worlds at their best do. They produce experiences that the design did not specifically author. The city of Falkreath has a history that its current political situation partially obscures. Before the holds were established in their current form, this region was part of High Rock's political sphere, a claim that contemporary Nords in Falkreath have largely absorbed. As a piece of interesting history rather than an ongoing grievance, though the Imperials have occasionally found it useful to remind them of it in diplomatic contexts. The borders of a province are rarely where they are for reasons that have nothing to do with the priorities of competing powers at a particular moment in history. The cemetery that dominates so much of Falkreath's physical space and Falkreath's emotional character is not the result of any particular catastrophe or ongoing elevated mortality. It is the result of a tradition maintained over generations of burying the dead with particular care and keeping the graves maintained over long periods. What this means is that Falkreath's relationship with its accumulated dead is more continuous and more present than most holds. The graves are not monuments to the past, they are part of the current landscape. The pine forest around Falkreath is old in ways that the cleared land around other holds farms is not. Old growth pine has a density and a height that changes the quality of the light and the movement of the air through it. The canopy filters the sky into something that arrives. At the ground is shadow and occasional brightness, and the forest floor below is a different ecological community from the forest above, adapted to what the canopy allows through. Mushrooms and ferns and the specific understory plants that do well in low light are the dominant species at ground level, and they are the ones most useful to falkreaths. Alchemists. The throat of the world as a physical space that can be fully climbed by the Dragonborn is one of those experiences in Skyrim that the questline eventually makes mandatory, but that can be approached earlier in a way that changes its character. Climbing the 7,000 steps, the actual number, whatever that actual number is, without the quest active, simply because the mountain is there, produces a relationship to the summit that is different from arriving with a specific errand. The Greybeards and their monastery are the same in either case. What changes is the quality of the arriving. Parthelnax at the summit is patient in both versions of the visit. He has been patient for longer than the distinction between versions of arrival has existed, and his patience is not a performance. It is the simple consequence of having had enough time with his own thoughts to become comfortable in their company. The wind that blows constantly at the summit is his element in the most direct sense. He is Dova, a being of sky and fire, and the cold wind at the top of the world is not uncomfortable for him in any meaningful way. The view from the summit on a clear day, the rarity of which is itself a small lesson about what to expect from Skyrim's weather, encompasses the province in a way that the map cannot quite replicate. The map abstracts. The view from the throat of the world makes the distances concrete, shows you where one hold ends and another begins in terms of the quality of the landscape rather than the position of a political line. The holds look different from up here. The road between them looks like what it is, a thin mark on a very large piece of ground. The echoes of the Dragon War in Skyrim's current landscape are not merely architectural. The word walls, the ancient structures that preserve shouts in a form that can be absorbed by those with the blood to receive them, are distributed in ways that map imperfectly. On to the later history of the province. Some are in places that subsequent generations built around or upon. Others are in places that subsequent generations avoided for reasons that were eventually forgotten, but that the landscape preserved in the form of cleared ground or unusual. Silence. The dragons who buried themselves and waited, who chose sleepover, continued existence in a world that had turned against them, made choices about where to bury themselves. That were not random. They chose high places and sacred places and defended places. Some chose locations near the words they had taught, as if proximity to that particular knowledge was a comfort they wanted maintained. The connection between the word walls and the dragon burial sites, when mapped together, suggests a relationship that no single text fully explains, but that the distribution of both makes visible. The bones of the ancient dead, Nord and Snow Elf and Dwemer, and the creatures that predate all of these, are part of Skyrim's geology in a sense that is not merely metaphorical. The province has been inhabited long enough by enough different peoples that the physical material of those inhabitants has become part of the soil, the stone, the specific chemical character of the water that runs through it. Skyrim is in this sense made partly of everything that ever lived in it, and this is more than a poetic observation. It is a fact about what old landscapes are. The smelters that dot Skyrim's mining towns, Shorestone in the Rift, Dawnstar's Quicksilver Mine, the iron operations in Halted Stream Camp, produce the raw material that the province's entire metalworking economy depends on. The process of smelting ore into ingots is one of those transformations that requires a specific combination of temperature and time and the patience to let the process complete, rather than hurrying it toward an outcome that has not yet been earned. The smelters burn through their fuel at rates that vary with the quality of the ore and the ambient temperature of the surrounding air, and the operators of these facilities develop over time an ear for what the smelter sounds like when it is doing its work correctly. The miners who work Skyrim's ore deposits have a professional relationship with the specific geological character of the deposits they work, the direction and depth of the veins, the quality of the ore at different depths, the way the rock behaves under the pickaxe at the beginning of a vein versus the exhausted end. This knowledge is practical and specific and not easily transferred between deposits, which means that an experienced miner at one site has knowledge that is genuinely different from an experienced miner at another, even if their general skill is identical. The orichalcum found in some of Skyrim's mines, a green-tinged ore associated specifically with Orcish smithing tradition, produces the dense and heavy Orcish equipment that the strongholds rely on. The connection between the ore and the culture that has developed the primary techniques for working it is one of those details that suggests a long history of adaptation. A. People learning the properties of a material available in their environment and developing a tradition of using those properties as fully as they can be used. The Dwemer's relationship to their automatons has been a subject of considerable scholarly speculation, partly because the automatons are still functional in a way that invites the question of what is making them function, and partly because the sophistication of their design implies a kind of understanding that is difficult to reconstruct from the evidence available. The animunculi, the general category of Dwemer mechanical creatures, were clearly designed with intentionality about their behavior, their defensive responses, their maintenance of the spaces they inhabit. Whether this intentionality was purely mechanical, the result of extremely sophisticated engineering that produces behavior resembling purpose without actually having it, or whether it involved something more than mechanism, is a question the texts leave open. The Dwemer's relationship to soul gem technology and the possibility that some of their mechanisms were powered by something analogous to captured consciousness has been raised in scholarly contexts without being definitively resolved. The automatons do not answer questions about this. They respond to motion and to heat signatures, and their responses are consistent and comprehensive. The Centurion steam handlers, found in the deepest Dwemer excavations, are the most sophisticated of the surviving automatons, capable of combat behavior that adapts to changing circumstances in ways that purely mechanical systems generally do not. Watching a Centurion respond to a threat that has changed its position, tracking and adjusting with a speed and accuracy that its bulk does not suggest, is one of those experiences in Skyrim's dungeons that makes the Dwemer feel genuinely impressive rather than merely ancient. The tavern songs that circulate through Skyrim's mead halls and inns encode history in the way that oral traditions always encode it, with emphasis, with compression, with the specific distortions that make a story singable and memorable rather than comprehensive and accurate. The history of Ragnar the Red, a legendary Nord warrior whose story appears in ballad form throughout the province, is almost certainly different in its full original form from what the song preserves. What the song preserves is the structure, the hero, the obstacle, the fatal choice, the ending that is tragic but not without honor, which is the structure of a particular kind, of Nordic story about what valor is and what it costs. The versions of the Civil War songs, the Age of Aggression and the Age of Oppression, which are the same song with different lyrics expressing opposite political positions, demonstrate something true about how music functions in political contexts. The melody is shared. The feeling invoked by the melody is shared. What differs is the story placed on top of the feeling, and this difference in story produces experiences of listening that feel genuinely opposed despite being built on. Identical musical materials. The bards who perform these songs in taverns on both sides of the civil divide are not always personally committed to the politics of the song they are performing. Performance requires a certain relationship to content that is not purely personal, the ability to embody a position long enough to deliver it effectively, then set it down. The experienced bard in a hold that changes hands periodically has had to develop this flexibility more acutely than most. The province of Skyrim has always been more than its conflicts suggest. It is a place where the ordinary and the mythic occupy the same road, the same valley, the same cold morning. The farmer who walks past a word wall on the way to the market does not stop to consider that the carved stone beside the path contains a fragment of a power that once moved thee. World. The child who plays near the ruins of a Dwemer outpost does not think about the civilization that built it, or the 4,000 years of absence since it fell quiet. This is how old places work. The weight of history is present, but not oppressive, available to those who look for it, invisible to those who do not. What Skyrim offers, at its quietest and most generous, is the experience of moving through a world that has been lived in completely, not a stage set, not a collection of locations organized around content delivery, a place with a past that informs its present, and a present that is complicated enough to reward attention without demanding it. The details are there. The silence between them is also there. Both are part of what the experience is. Tonight we move through some of those details, the old and the everyday, the cosmic and the domestic, the ancient dragons and the ordinary smelters, the Daedric princes and the innkeepers, the schools of magic and the fishing spots. Skyrim contains all of these at once, and the containing is what makes it feel like a world rather than a story. Thanks for watching. If these stories helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.